layered with social media notifications and chaotic crosstalk. You hear snippets of outrage, condemnation, a celebrity's public apology dissected and torn apart online. A politician points a finger, calling their opponent an enemy of the people. The word conspiracy echoes, followed by grainy images from a protest, faces twisted in anger and fear. The noise builds, a whirlwind of modern anxieties, accusations, and digital pitchforks. Then, silence. Welcome back. This is Vix, and you're listening to Random Witchcraft. What if I told you that the engine of fear and powering these headlines, the very social mechanics fueling our endless online outrage, isn't new at all? What if I told you it's an ancient machine, one that's been assembled and reassembled for centuries, and it always demands a sacrifice? What if I told you that the same forces that led to the execution of tens of thousands of innocent people for the impossible crime of witchcraft are still at play today, shaping our world in ways we barely recognize? The names have changed, the technology has evolved, but the mechanics of fear, the blueprint for turning neighbor against neighbor, that hasn't. To understand the chaos of today's, we have to journey back to the darkest of the past. Before we step back in time, we need to map. We need a map. We need to understand the terrain of what sociologists call a moral panic. Think of it as a social virus. It doesn't spread through the air, but through whispers, rumors, and shared anxieties. Even moral panic, from the historical to the hypermodern, is built from the same core ingredients. First, it all starts with a society under stress, a population gripping by a deep, gnawing anxiety. This could be economic collapse, plague, war, or even rapid culture change that leaves people feeling adrift and powerless. The world feels like it's spinning out of control, and the old rules no longer apply. This widespread unease is the dry tinder, just waiting for a spark. Second, you need a scapegoat, a person or a group who can be blamed for everything. They're called folk devils, and crucially, this group is often marginalized, different, or misunderstood. They exist on the fringes, which makes them an easy target. They're painted not just as people with different ideas, but as a fundamental threat to the community's moral fabric. They become the other, the source of all the rot. Third, you need a threat, one that's usually exaggerated or completely made up. This isn't a simple disagreement. It's a story about the existential conspiracy meant to destroy everything society holds dear. It's the belief that these folk devils, are enraged in secret, evil activities to corrupt the children, undermine the faith, and bring about the end of the world. This narrative gives a simple answer to a complex, frightening world. All of our problems, all of our fears can be traced back to them. And finally, you need a way to amplify it all fast. In the past, this was the town crier, the church pulpit, and the brand new printing press. Today, it's the frictionless, algorithmic world of social media and the 24-hour news cycle. This machine takes that initial spark of the accusation and fans it into the inferno of collective hysteria, where questioning the narrative becomes more dangerous than just joining the mob. anxiety, a scapegoat, a conspiracy, and an amplifier. Those four things are the engine of every witch hunt in history. They're the building blocks of fear, and to see this engine in its most raw and brutal force, we have to go back in time when the world was cold, dark, and utterly terrified. Imagine a world without science, without sanitation, without the comforting certainty of modern medicine. Now imagine that world getting colder. From about the year 1300 onwards, Europe was plunged into a period of climatic cooling known as the Little Ice Age. Summers became short and wet. Winters were brutal and long. Crops failed, and not once, but year after year, famine was a constant threat, stalking the edge of every village. Malnutrition was everywhere, leaving people weak and vulnerable. Then in 1347, a new horror arrived, the Black Death, a pandemic so devastating it's almost impossible for us to comprehend. It swept across the continent, wiping out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. In this world, death wasn't some abstract concept, it was a daily, visceral reality. The world felt fundamentally broken, cursed. People were desperate for answers. Why was this happening? Why was God punishing them so severely? For a time, the blame fell on different groups, but slowly, a more insidious explanation began to take root. The idea grew that this wasn't random divine anger. This was a coordinated attack, a conspiracy. Church inquisitors began to argue that simple folk magic wasn't just superstition. It was proof of a pact with the ultimate evil, Satan. They claimed a vast secret army of witches was working with the devil to bring about the ruin of Christendom. They were causing the plagues, blighting the crops, killing the livestock, and snatching babies from their cradles. This story transformed the village healer to the eccentric widow from a local oddball to a soldier in a cosmic war. This fear, though, needed a manual, and in 1486, it got one. A Dominican inquisitor named Hendrik Kramer wrote a book that would become one of the most destructive texts in history, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This book was state-sanctioned guide to identifying, persecuting, and exterminating witches. It was a terrifying bestseller for its era, reprinted dozens of times and becoming one of the most influential books in history. It laid out in horrifying detail the supported nature of witches and their pact with the devil. It describes the witches' Sabbath, a secret gathering where they would allegedly engage in orgies, cannibalize infants, and pay homage to their dark master. But its most devastating section was the third, which gave judges a step-by-step guide for interrogation. It legitimatized paranoia as a legal tool. Heresy and public rumor was now valid evidence, and most critically, it explicitly sanctioned the use of torture to get a confession. This created a terrifying, unbreakable loop. An accused person, often a woman who was simply unpopular or eccentric, would be arrested. She'd profess her innocence. The torture would begin. Thumbscrews, the rack, sleep deprivation. Under unimaginably agony, the victim would eventually confess to anything just to make it stop. But the confession wasn't enough. The torturers then demanded names. Who else was at the Sabbath? Who were your accomplices? Desperate and broken, the victims would name other people, maybe someone she disliked, or maybe just random names that came to her in a haze of pain. Those people were then arrested, and the whole horrific process started all over again. The Malus Maleficarum didn't just describe a conspiracy, it created one by generating its own evidence through systematic brutality. As one German official, Johannes Janus, wrote to his daughter from his cell in 1628 before his own execution for witchcraft, "Innocent I have come to prison, innocent I have been tortured, innocent must I die. For whoever comes into the witch prison must become a witch or be tortured until he invents something out of its head." The Manual of Terror lit the fuse on the tinderbox of European anxiety. The period from the rough 1560 to 1660 became known as the Great Hunt, or the Burning Times, across the continent, but with terrifying intensity in the Holy Roman Empire. The pyres were lit. Estimates suggest that somewhere around 100,000 people were formally tried for witchcraft, and about 40,000 to 50,000 were executed. And who were these witches? Were they powerful sorcerers? No, they were overwhelmingly women, often poor, elderly, and widowed. They were midwives whose medical knowledge was viewed with suspicion. They were herbalists. They were people who owned a little too much land. Or not enough. They were people who didn't go to church often enough, or who went too often. They were simply people who were different in a society that craved conformity and was desperate for someone to blame. The witch hunts weren't a hunt for the devil. They were a war on the unconventional, fueled by fear and codified by the Book of Lies. While the flames burned brightest in Europe, the embers of this madness crossed the Atlantic. They were carried in the minds of people seeking a new world but bringing their oldest fears with them. They landed in the rocky soil of New England and in 1692 erupted in a small anxious community called Salem. The Salem witch trials were probably the most famous witch hunt in history, but they weren't anywhere near the largest. So why do we remember Salem? Because it's a perfectly preserved case study in mass hysteria, a microcosm of how fast a community can descend into madness. In the end, 20 people were executed, 19 by hanging, and one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death. At least 5 others died in the squalor of the jail. The Puritan community of the late 17th century, Massachusetts, was a pressure cooker of anxiety. They were surrounded by a vast wilderness they saw as the devil's domain. They were in the state of ongoing brutal war with local Native American tribes. Their strict, unforgiving religion taught them they were in a constant battle for their own souls. On top of all of this, political instability with England had left the colony in a state of legal limbo. Into this tinderbox, a spark fell into the winter of 1692. In the home of the village minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started having strange fits. They would contort their bodies, cry out in pain, and make strange noises. A local doctor found no physical cause or ominous suggestion the evil hand was at work. Soon, other young women in the village began showing the same afflictions. Pressured by magistrates, the girls named their tormentors. The first 3 accused were perfect targets: Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman in a dispute over her late husband's estate. They were outcasts, the weakest members of the community. But the real fuel for the fire was legal concept called spectral evidence. The afflicted girls claimed the specters, or spirits, of the accused were pinching them, choking them, and tempting them to sign the devil's book. This was the ultimate unprovable accusation. How could you defend yourself against something your spirit was supposedly doing while your body was somewhere else? In the fevered atmosphere of Salem, the court chose to believe the accusers. With the court accepting spectral evidence, the floodgate opened. Accusations spiraled outwards, no longer aimed to just outcasts, respected churchgoers, landowners, or even a former minister was arrested. To confess was to save your life, but it meant admitting to a pact with the devil and naming other witches. To maintain your innocence, as many bravely did, was to seal your fate. Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper, was the first to be hanged. She was followed by Rebecca Nurse, a frail 71-year-old matriarch whose execution sent a shockwave through the community. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then anyone could. People were accused to settle old scores for disputes over land or just being a little too different. One man, an 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea. For his defiance, he was crushed to death with heavy stones. His last words were reportedly, "More weight." By the autumn of 1692, the hysteria began to break. Prominent leaders from Boston, like Increase Mather, publicly condemned the reliance on spectral evidence, arguing it was better that 10 suspected witches escape than one innocent person be condemned. The governor, whose own wife had been accused, finally intervened and dissolved the court. The trials were over. In the years that followed, jurors and accusers issued public apologies admitting their guilt. The community began the slow process of reconciliation, but the lesson was seared into the American consciousness. A community crippled by fear and convinced its own righteousness had murdered its own people. It's so easy to look back at the pyres of Europe and the gallows of Salem and think, we would never do that today. We're more enlightened. We have science. We have due process. But that comfort is a dangerous illusion. The human tendency to hunt for witches never really went away. The machinery of fear that engine built from anxiety, scapegoats, and conspiracy isn't a historical artifact. It's a fundamental part of social psychology. The operating system is just been updated. Let's look at the patterns. The core components are all around us. After hiding in plain sight, the societal anxiety in the 17th century, it was plague, famine, and the fear of God's wrath. Today, our anxieties are different, but just as strong. We fear economic collapse, the dizzying speed of technology, political polarization that feels like a cold civil war, and a sense of cultural displacement. The world again feels like it's spinning out of control. This creates a powerful desire for simple answers and someone to blame. The scapegoat, back then, it was the old woman at the edge of town. Today, the targets are more varied. It can be a political opponent, framed not as someone with a different policy, but as a traitor trying to destroy the nation. It can be immigrants blamed for economic problems or cultural change. It can be an entire generation, a social class, or anyone who breaks the ever-shifting rules of online discourse. The target is always someone who can easily othered and dehumanized. The unprovable evidence. This is where the parallels get really chilling. The Puritans had spectral evidence. We have screenshots without context. Anonymous online accusations, selectively edited videos, and conspiracy theories that weave random facts into a sinister story. This also includes the idea of a recovered memory. Just like a spectral vision, a memory supposedly recovered through hypnosis or suggestive therapy is impossible to independently verify and nearly impossible to defend against. Both put the burden of the proof on the accused to disprove a phantom. And the amplification mechanism, the Malus Maleficarum, was a revolution in fear-mongering, using the printing press to spread the hunt. Today, our societal media platforms are the Malus Maleficarum on steroids. Algorithms designed for engagement don't care about truth, they just care about emotional reaction. And outrage is the most engaging emotion of all. These platforms can take a single rumor and blast it to millions in an instant, creating a digital mob that forms and attacks before anyone can check the facts. The village square is now global, and the pitchforks are pixels. The names and technologies are different, but the pattern is the same. A frightened population is given a simple enemy. The case is built on unverifiable claims, and the story is amplified until it becomes an unassailable truth. To see this pattern play out almost perfectly, we only need to look back a few decades to a time when America was once again convinced the devil was walking among us. The 1980s, a decade of big hair, neon colors, and a new kind of anxiety. The cultural shifts of the 60s and 70s had left many feeling unmoored. There was a rising fear of secularism, a backlash against feminism, and a growing influence of fundamental Christian groups who felt the nation was in moral decay. Once again, society was a tinderbox of anxiety waiting for a spark. The spark came in 1980 with the book called Michelle Remembers, co-written by a psychiatrist and his patient, Michelle Smith. The book claimed to be a true account of Smith's repressed memories of horrific abuse by a satanic cult when she was a child. These memories were supposedly recovered through hours of hypnosis. The book was a sensation, tapping into deep-seated fear and launching a nationwide moral panic that would last for over a decade. The Satanic Panic. Suddenly, stories of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, were everywhere. The narrative was strikingly similar to the ones in the Malus Maleficarum, and alleged a vast, secret international network of Satanists who were infiltrated every level of society, breeding babies for sacrifice and conducting twisted rituals. And just like in the 17th century, the panic was fueled by a new class of experts and a new form of evidence. This time, the experts weren't inquisitors, they were therapists, social workers, and police officers, and the evidence wasn't spectral, it was the recovered memory. A therapeutic trend emerged that believed trauma could be unearthed through hypnosis, guided imagery, and leading questions. This created the same kind of self-fulfilling loop as torture. Vulnerable patients eager to please their therapist could be subtly encouraged to remember. The more bizarre the memory, the more it seemed to confirm the satanic conspiracy. The panic spread like wildfire through the new amplifiers of the era, daytime talk shows, the sensationalist news. Gerardo Rivera in 1987 special Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground, was watched by millions and presented the most outlandish claims as facts. The result was a modern-day witch hunt for real victims. The more notorious case was The McMartin preschool trial, which began in California in 1983. It started with a single unsubstantiated accusation. Soon, investigators began interviewing the children using highly suggestive techniques with anatomically correct dolls and leading questions. They were coaxed. They coaxed the children into telling increasingly impossible stories of being flown through the air, witness animal sacrifices, and digging secret tunnels beneath the school. The case ballooned. 7 teachers were charged. The trial began, the longest and most expensive in American history. In the end, after 6 years, millions of dollars, and immeasurable trauma, the case fell apart. There was not one shred of physical evidence. The secret tunnels didn't exist. It was eventually recognized by legal scholars as a modern witch hunt. All charges were dropped, but the lives of the accused were shattered. There were other cases, like West Memphis 3, where 3 teenagers were convicted of murder based largely on the idea that their interest in heavy metal music meant that they were part of a satanic cult. They were finally exonerated after spending 18 years in prison. In the mid-1980s, the Satanic Panic fizzled out. An FBI report found no evidence of any large-scale satanic conspiracy. The recovered memory therapists that fueled the panic were largely discredited, but the damage was done. Innocent people had their lives destroyed based on rumors and fantastical stories, amplified by credulous media. The pattern was identical to Salem. The anxiety was different. The evidence had a new name, but the result was the same. If the Satanic Panic was the last witch hunt of the analog world, then our own century has seen the dawn of a digital witch hunt. The internet, specifically social media, has been the new village square. But this was a square with no geography, no time zones, and an audience of billions, and the most powerful amplifier of fear and outrage humanity has ever invented. And in 2016, we saw the Salem playbook executed with digital precision in a conspiracy theory known as Pizzagate. It began in the dark corners of online forums during a contentious presidential election. Hacked emails from a campaign chairman were released, and the conspiracy theorists pour over them. Searching for hidden meanings, they claim that innocuous references to food like cheese pizza were actually code words for a child trafficking ring. This baseless theory quickly mutated into a monstrous story that a popular family-friendly pizzeria in Washington, D.C., Comet Ping Pong, was the headquarters of a satanic elite-run child abuse ring. The evidence was absurd. The restaurant's logo had a moon, which was linked to satanic ritual symbols. The owner had art on his walls that deemed suspicious. They claimed a secret basement held captive children, a basement that didn't exist. This was pure spectral evidence for a new era. Innuendo and outright lies woven into a horrific tapestry, and the algorithm of platforms like Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube did their job perfectly. The story changed with the potent emotions of protecting children, and hating political enemies went viral. The lie spread so far, so fast that polls showed a shocking number of people believed it was true. The digital witch hunt had very real, terrifying consequences. The restaurant and its employees were bombarded with death threats. And on December 4th, 2016, a man from North Carolina, armed with AR-15 rifle, drove to Comet Ping Pong to self-investigate. He fired his weapon inside the crowd, at the crowded restaurant before being arrested. He was there to free the children he was certain there was being held in the non-existent basement. A rumor that started in the digital either well, had manifested as a man with a gun. This same machinery is visible in what's often called cancel culture. While holding people accountable is a necessary part of a functioning society, the dynamic of a digital mob often mirrors the mechanics of a moral panic. A person's past statements are decontextualized. Their apology is deemed insufficient, and a swarm of anonymous accounts descend, demanding that they be fired or socially ostracized. The goal is often not restorative justice, it's an expulsion from the tribe. And in a final ironic twist, the very term witch hunt has been turned on its head. Historically, it described the powerful prosecution of powerless. Today, the term is frequently co-opted by some of the most powerful people in the world to deflect any kind of scrutiny. By crying witch hunt, they try to frame themselves as the victims, a rhetoric trick that robs the term of its historical power. So, after this long journey through centuries of fear, what do we do with all this? What's a lesson in the ashes of the pyres and the echoes of the abandoned courtrooms? The sobering truth is that the witch hunt isn't something we outgrew. It's a dormant virus that lives inside every society, waiting for the right conditions to activate. It's dark potential within our own psychology and desire for simple answers. The tribal impulse to unify against a common enemy, the satisfying thrill of the mob. There's no easy fix, no policy or technological patch can erase this part of human nature. The only defense, the only real solution is awareness. It's the power that comes from understanding this historical pattern by seeing how easily societies have descended into panic. We can become more resilient to its modern forms. We can learn to pause before sharing that outrageous headline. We can question narratives that provide a too perfect enemy to blame for all our problems. We can learn to spot the difference between justice and vengeance, between accountability and the mob rule. We can learn to look for the humanity in those we're told to hate and fear. I'm generally curious to hear your thoughts. Where do you see the patterns playing out today? In politics, in the media, or in our own online communities? Share your reflections in the comments below, or you can contact me on vix@randomwitchcraft.com and we will share. And let's have a thoughtful discussion, because history teaches us that the line between neighbor and mob, between justice and persecution, is terrifyingly thin. And the first step is to not repeating the mistakes of the past. Is it to understand them, to stare them in the face, and to remember the innocent who paid the price for our timeless human fear? You have been listening to Random Witchcraft. Till next time. Bye for now.